All right. Hi, class. It is week 3 for our grade 12 philosophy course. You'll find week 3, we're a bit more focused on one thing rather than with the Pre-Socratics. It forces us back in week 2 to go through a number of separate thinkers and ideas and schools. For week 3, we're going to go deeper on Socrates, you could say, but so deep that we're not exactly going through all of Socrates. We're going to really pick up on how he begins the concept of virtue and vice, and putting primary value on individual moral action above other questions, theories, matters of group association, political development. He says, whatever you think about those things, your own behavior. He's kind of the first person telling you to clean your room. Your own behavior should be the most important. If everybody takes care of their own individual moral behavior, better things happen. People have a hard time placing his exact views about everything else because of how focused he was on that in his conversations, the Socratic dialogues he had, where he looked for contradictions people gave in their answers to questions, and then he just asked more questions until they clarified their own contradictions and came to deeper first principles. All right, so we're gonna go deep on virtue this week. Everyone since, before and since Socrates in the world of human thought and connecting thought to action has had some concept of virtue and vice. Some people try to make totally different views. You'll find what we give you in the reading tries to balance different types of virtue and vice. So even though you can go from 7 virtues and vices to 100, under a broad 7-fold list of categories, we give 50 specific examples. And we'll see what you guys think of that. It should be interesting to see what you think you're strong with the virtues and vices, what you think you're weak with. And if you see something that makes you go, oh, I think that may have been true for some people at some time, but I don't think that should be treated as objectively moral. And that's going to be a fascinating conversation. All right, so for today in this lecture, which as you'll see on the homepage, I propose that you start with the reading this week, then go into discussion, and then watch this lecture, having done reading, having done discussion, before you go into the paragraph that you write before next Sunday. Okay, so for this week in this lecture, I'm going to give you some historical context on Socrates, going to use the virtues to kind of elaborate on what we started last week with universals. And you'll see with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they took what the Pre-Socratics kind of created sketches of when it comes to universals and greatly refined them. And we'll elaborate a bit too on the schema I started last week that we're going to propose to you guys throughout the course. See if you think it's a good schema, if you can use it to argue what's real and what's not real, or if you think there's a better framework, that's great. Write about that. Let me know. I always want to learn new things. All right, so with that in mind, historical context on Socrates. All right, he's living in Athens at a time of major flux in Athenian history. So Athens had been a prosperous city-state, in fact, the dominant city-state for quite a long time, going into Socrates' lifetime. And as they had been a dominant city-state, a thing to take note of is that the city-states of the Mediterranean world and a few other parts of the world, you see it a bit in India, a bit in China, Eurasian areas, Persia, between the East and the West, and arguably with correct me, it's either the Mayans or the Incas, the earliest one in Central America, who had built up cities. They get into these 3 models as well. The 3 political models that are important to know about are monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. So monarchy is rule by one. Oligarchy is rule by a few. Democracy is rule by many. And then later on, Aristotle proposes that if you're outside of those, you will either have a horrible dictatorship or an anarchy, the type of thing Thomas Hobbes said was the state of nature, all against all, everyone's fighting each other. So anarchy in a bad way that causes violence, or tyranny, which is self-evident for excessive authority bringing about injustice and violence, and that anything that's not tyranny or anarchy is going to be either rule by one, rule by few, rule by many. One more reference to Aristotle, then we'll save him for a few weeks from now. He argued the best models combined all three, and I would, in my own humble opinion, tell you that the Westminster system that we use in Canada, that Britain has, that Australia has, that is largely used in India. India mixes Westminster with some elements of the classical republic, as well as Japan, Singapore, Jamaica. What makes these countries function is that the Westminster system follows Aristotle's advice. There is monarchy, there is oligarchy, there is democracy, all balancing each other. But that's getting ahead of political philosophy. You just need to know that Socrates was living in a world where there were city-states forming empires beyond their borders. And as this was happening, some city-states were more about monarchy, some were more about oligarchy, some were more about democracy. And Athens got into democracy, okay? And their democracy, you need to realize, was a bit different from how we're considering democracy. It was any freeborn male, so you had two Athenian parents, you were a male, you were older than 18, you not only could vote, but you had to. You were expected to participate in different public forums that made decisions regarding where the government would go in its policies. And similar to the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee in American indigenous history, who did that with women above the age of 18, whether it was women or men, freeborn, having membership in the community, being part of the political decision-making process, there's an assumption with both Athens and the Haudenosaunee that those people are listening to their families. So the woman or the guy in their family who can't vote, their parents, their children, servants, or slaves should be giving them ideas. And when this system, the older democracy, functioned, it was because the people who were electors, who became senators and politicians because of their birthright in the democratic system, they were listening to people around them who didn't have these political rights. And then you could argue it falls apart when they stop listening to their communities. And you see in Athens, sure, they call themselves democracy, but there's lots of powerful interests in Athens who get more privileges out of democracy than other people get. And that's where there's always the controversy of when does a democracy become an oligarchy, where the top people in every field are making the decisions rather than some majority consensus, and when does having a balance between all the different fields of human life lead to something more democratic. Either way, Socrates got on the wrong side of the Athenian democracy. And that's the controversy we go into in our reading. Okay, so Socrates, we know he had middle to upper middle class parents. He was a soldier in his youth, served well for the Athenian army. And then when he came back, all we know after his military career is that he was often in Athens talking to people downtown, doing his Socratic method of asking questions and guiding conversations with questions, looking for contradictions, asking for deeper principles, and drawing people to the importance of moral individual behavior. Okay? Since Athens had philosophers, but it also had people who were very much more into the prior trial and error mode of living and the mythological understanding of the world, putting them together, you had the polytheistic religion of Athens with the democratic politics, and you could argue more oligarchic types of economics, more hierarchy when it comes to how people produce wealth and enjoy wealth. And in that Athens, coming to not like Socrates, they started viewing him as a bit of a disturber of sorts, that he was manipulating people with his questions and conversations and undermining the political order. As that tension and conflict between Socrates and the Athenian establishment, or at least the consensus of Athenian government and life at the time, as that happened, you see debates in the history since then as to whether Socrates was sort of an atomist and going in an atheist direction, and that's why, aside from disturbing the peace, they accused him of undermining public religion because they were polytheistic, or if he was more monist on the verge of Plato and Aristotle, if he had a sense of a spiritual first principle that could be called theistic, or yeah, basically the early belief in God as we understand God in Judeo-Christian culture, Islamic culture especially too, and elements of Hindu and Buddhist culture. Which one he was is an interesting debate, but it's not exactly the most important debate. We just know that as he had his older age career, asking people questions and becoming involved in political debates because of his discussions and debates with people in Athens. As that happened, you have at the exact same time the end of Athenian dominance in the ancient Greek world. Athens has a 30-year conflict with Sparta, the more warrior oligarchy city-state, as opposed to a citizens' democracy like Athens. They are at first successful, but over a 30-year period, they gradually become less successful. The Spartans win the war, temporarily conquer Athens. And then a bunch of people who had been the heads of powerful families and the heads of different sectors of industry who had some power in Athens, who didn't like the democratic system, who thought that was why they lost the war. They got set up by the Spartans as like a client government, a proxy government. They were called the 30 Tyrants. It kind of tells you they didn't last very long. They were quickly overthrown by the rest of Athens, and Athens at least regained its independence. So you could say Athens lost the war, but they won the peace, and gradually they rebuilt a bit of their former glory, but not all of it. And that shock of losing their status as top dog in world affairs affects a lot of their philosophical discussions. And eventually, if you care about the history side of it, there's about 50 years, I could be wrong, of Spartan dominance, eventually an alliance of city-states with Athens in it, but led more by Corinth, I believe. Again, ancient history masters, correct me, but someone other than Athens led the alliance of city-states, which did eventually defeat Sparta and restore balance of power to many city-states, as opposed to one being totally dominant. Then after that, you get Alexander the Great, the Macedonian Empire. After that, the Romans conquer, you get into the Roman Empire, Roman world. But the big thing to remember is that Socrates was friends with the people who wanted Athens to become an oligarchy. And many people started thinking that he himself wanted Athens to become an oligarchy, and that part of what happened to him might have been just being on the wrong side of the fallout of the Athenians overthrowing the 30 tyrants who wanted to have a more Spartan style rule by few militaristic government. Their overthrow meant that Socrates found himself on the wrong side of politics in an era where if you could be proven as a traitor, you could be executed. So there's a chance that that's part of why he was executed, but there's also a good chance, if you look at Plato's version of events and a few others who wrote versions of the trial of Socrates, there is reason to believe that there's also just sincere tension between the Athenian people and Socrates and his followers about whether free speech can involve any discussion whatsoever, and whether it can involve questions without answers. Something about questions without answers really irritated a lot of Athenians. They thought that Socrates was being coy, and that's kind of like the final question with Socrates is he sincere about what he said at his trial about individual moral behavior being what's truly important, and you need to have free speech for that? Or was he using conversations where he never said his broader theory about how things should be for communities and society as a whole? Was he using an evasive form of questioning to manipulate easily manipulated people on behalf of oligarchs or power players? And that's what Plato really pushed back on. He hated that idea that basically he thought sophists were accusing Socrates of being a sophist. A sophist was someone who used clever sounding arguments that ultimately were not true to manipulate people to do the will of the powerful. And Plato pushed back hard, saying, no, there's power players in a democracy, in the oligarchy, and if we look to other city-states that are monarchies, there's definitely power players who are not the sole king or the sole queen. And in any system, you have people with more power than others, and Plato pushed back saying, no, it's people who had plenty of power didn't like that they couldn't control Socrates. And they accused him of being like them. Basically a huge distraction operation. That's going to be something we talk about in our reading. Last thing before we go into the virtues and universals is that it is, I think, in Socrates' favor that he went with the whole process and he chose to drink poison and say, no, I'm not leaving town. They gave him an opportunity to leave and just go somewhere else and not be killed. He said, no, I will die for what I hold to be true. And I think people who are just manipulating others and who want to become part of the power game in any society tend to not want to sacrifice themselves. So being a martyr for truth really does make most people go in a direction of Socrates was a good guy. He was sincere talking about virtue, and he was sincere asking people to question everything they believed and get to a first principle that was consistent and could be communicated to others and could later on lead to broader developments with communities and politics and society. I think he truly felt that was other people's business. His job was to be a teacher. Another thing going in his direction was that he did teach people for free. Okay, he didn't charge for his services, and it seems like he was subsidized by some of these people who became the 30 tyrants, but he took their subsidies to offer free education, and he seems to seriously value free speech. So free speech and the difference between public life and private life are issues that come out of the life of Socrates. You'll notice that the Greeks don't seem to have a concept in the trial of Socrates of a public-private distinction, that you can have thoughts and opinions privately that don't affect the public good, the common good, the political situation. We in Westminster societies and in republics like America, France, South Africa, Ireland, most of Latin America, parts of Africa, Asia, people in representative government societies, whether it's Westminster or a republic, in the modern world have a sense of private life where you can have your opinions and express them, and it's understood that you're not automatically saying that every private viewpoint should be politically enforced, and that there's a difference between what we say should be politically the case for the law and what people in a free society associating with who they agree with and not with who they disagree with. That idea doesn't seem to be there. It seems like in the classical Greek city-states, there's a sense that any issue of controversy or above a certain level of importance is inherently political, and they don't have a sense of private-public distinction, and they get into this territory where certain opinions and ideas can get you imprisoned or outlawed or banished or killed. And it's there, and you see it throughout history. And most modern people value free speech, but then there's situations where they don't like the effects of free speech, and it's a huge issue going throughout history. That's why we're going to make our paragraph more about free speech and our discussion more about the virtues and universals, how they are universals. So there's the first part, historical context. We're done with, or at least we've talked about here. We can talk about it more later. When it comes to the virtues, I'm going to emphasize here how the virtues really are the next level in the history of philosophy for universals becoming developed and fleshed out into at least a schema. Maybe not a hyper-detailed system, but a schema, an outline of categories for what are universals. Okay, so last week I was saying how they can be distinguished from thoughts and ideas in the imagination, thoughts and ideas that are abstractions, and then thoughts and ideas that are truly universals. Could be three different things. Okay, so the human capacity to have ideas and sensations and thoughts that are pretty specific and they're not connected strictly to the world around them. We have lots of expressions and statements that are not just describing literally what is in front of you. That whole dynamic leads to the development of universals. And there's one situation that people in the modern world want to avoid, where something completely unconnected to reality is asserted too strongly with no connection, again, to different parts of reality. And you hear the phrase untethered to reality, some abstractions being held to be too abstract, and that it's kind of a pushback on more mystical traditions. That's one thing people avoid in the modern world. In the other direction, there's the reaction against, overly material and mechanical and false realist, you could say, perspectives. That's, if you took it to an extreme, you would deny that there's numbers like 2 and shapes like triangles and things that you can't grab the perfect instantiation of it in reality, but you see it, when you see it. It goes across situations. It has validity manifesting in the world, but it has something outside of the world that's permanent to it. Okay, what I just said might be the middle ground between overly mechanistic and overly abstract takes on reality. And that's why universals are a major part of philosophy, sort of the unique bread and butter for certain elements of philosophy that distinguishes it from history or sociology or psychology, other things, looking at other angles. Just universals that go across all situations are a big deal. And the idea with virtue being the capacity and ability to do good acquired by habit, and then types of good action, good choice, good being, yet delineated according to virtues, as in your ability to do it. Being prudent in one situation is different from being prudent in another situation. Having fortitude in one situation is different from having fortitude in a different situation. But the actualizing of the good through human choice and human habit and human behavior, the fact that the idea of habit growing your ability to do more and more of the good, and how there is a direction to do more and more of what's wrong, bad, or evil, really shows us psychological and relational and political realities that are affected by universals. Okay? Prudence, temperance, justice, fortitude, 4 big ones. Okay? Underneath that, you get tons of subcategories. For most religious traditions, you get faith and hope and charity. For certain secular traditions, right now what's coming to mind is the Stoics and even some Platonists who are less religious. You get wisdom, courage, moderation as like the ultimate 3. A lot of different cultures have senses of an ultimate 3, and then the 4 of prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, being a bit below the top 3, but still super important. That's one thing in common between most cultures is the 7 virtues and the 7 vices, even though the exact specifics change. And we're trying to balance all those different specifics in the list we give you in our reading. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward to you. Doing the good has specific types, and those specific types of doing the good transfer to countless different situations in countless different ways, but you still see the universal of doing the good. All right, that's really where Socrates takes it to a new level when it comes to what are ideals, what are abstractions, what is the immaterial part of our experience, what does it mean, okay, and how can we categorize how real and how not real the ideals are. He takes it to a new level. It starts with the Pre-Socratics, he takes it to a new level. Arguably, it gets crystallized with Plato, the theory of forms. Every ideal is its own independent real thing that is in a world of forms, either overlapping or above the material world. And then people who have some issues with the minor details kind of get into Aristotle, because Aristotle, as he lays out logic and various scientific methods with respect for philosophy and first principles, he refines the theory of forms. Okay, you really shouldn't think of Aristotle as rejecting the theory of forms. He seems to think that there's a lot of potential. He just thinks that the ideals that we perceive and that we remember, whether it's stop sign or person or lake, anything that we have a perception of and we remember it and it goes across different situations, he just thinks that the form of that essence is in the matter. That's Aristotle. Whereas form being separate from the matter and something is connecting the two, that's Plato. Okay, but we can't get there without talking about Socrates and how his questions got people refining all the pre-Socratic ideas, as well as traditions of trial and error and mythological worldviews that we're not in the pre-Socratic philosophy, but we're still very present in his world. His Socratic method of talking about things with questions and looking for first principles refined a lot of those things and then took us to a new understanding of universals, which is demonstrated by virtue and by vice. Okay, so having talked about his historical context and how his method led to some major innovations, we'll just finish by reminding you, really, having a sense that universals can be numbers and shapes. They can be signs of music and art. They can be moral dynamics of what is good and what is evil and how they're observable with patterns of cause and effect. Okay, those are 3 types of universals we've fleshed out so far. Other universals will be consciousness and its connection to reality itself, leading to an understanding of what the highest reality is, what the deepest part of reality is, what is making it all happen. Seems to be universals coming out of our average experience, the world of change and what does not change, showing us universals. Okay, as that gets refined, I'll remind you guys of this schema I'm proposing, whereby a universal that we're thinking of, whether it's imagination, maybe that's just helpful for one person, whether it's an abstraction, maybe an abstraction is helpful for groups of people, but not all people, and maybe a universal is an ideal that's helpful for everybody in all times and places, which is why that top level gets controversial. People have different takes on what truly is universal. In that understanding, I'll remind you that to distinguish imagination, abstraction, universal, we can think of is the ideal, which is separate from any matter, material thing we encounter. Is that ideal real and spiritual? Is it real and material in some other material, deeper material way? Is it not real but helpful? You could argue measurements of space and time, centimeters, minutes. Aside from centimeters and minutes, elements of psychology, a lot of you were talking about David Chalmers with laws of psychology. That could be not real in a strict way. In fact, it's not material and it's not spiritual. If you deny either one of those things, it's not real, but it's helpful. And the Arab philosophers, who we'll learn about in a few weeks' time, who preserved a lot of the ancient world and then helped both the West and the East relearn ancient principles, those Arab philosophers had notions of secondary concepts to get at the idea of stuff in our mind that might not be material, may or may not be spiritual, depending on whether you accept that there's a possibility or a reality to the spiritual, but it still helps us, and it's connected to change in space or change in time or change in a person's inner self. Those are secondary concepts for the Arab philosophers. That's one way of looking at it. Okay, and then lastly, not real and not helpful in knowing that there are concepts that could be completely like imaginary and not connected to anything good or real in any way. Okay, so yeah, real and spiritual, real and material, not real, helpful, secondary concept, not real, not helpful, imaginary gibberish. Those 4 categories, I think, are how we can argue over with each other in respectful ways over the coming weeks when we talk about in moral life, in metaphysical principles, in other top parts of philosophy. When we get to a thing where we got to say, is this ideal real and how so? Then we'll be appealing to one of those 4 categories and then trying to argue why this non-material experience fits into one category and not one of the other 3. And yeah, if you think that there's some way to process non-material, non-immediate experience that is totally outside of those 4 categories, please do let me know. That would be awesome to have you guys present alternatives. Okay, so yeah, hopefully you've done the reading by this point and done the discussion, and you watch this video to get some ideas for your paragraph. And if something I said you really agreed with or disagreed with, and you want to make that like a second paragraph, what I agreed with and disagreed with in the video, that can give you bonus marks. Remember, we use logical principles and polite discussion to demonstrate proposals, really. One thing that you learn when you're in philosophy is that differences and disagreements can just be a matter of proposing an alternative and trusting the other person to think about that alternative, not like we have to try and change each other. Okay, hopefully that helps you feel comfortable to express different viewpoints, knowing that we're all going to take it as an alternative proposal to contemplate, and we're not going to try and change each other. We respect each other as we are, and we can have connections in our differences. All right, thanks a lot. We'll see you next week.